there used to be a club, Klärchens Ballhaus. It still exists actually, but it used to have telephones. And I actually went in there right after the walk-in, and you could go in there and sit down at a table, and there's a telephone, and it worked. And you could call people at different tables, right? So it was easier to get information whether these people are actually interested or not. So welcome to this course. This is Labor Markets with Search Frictions. My name is Michael Burda, and I'll be giving this course. It's a master's course, so if you're a bachelor's student, you shouldn't be here. It's also open to PhD students. In fact, we encourage PhD students who are interested in labor markets and labor economics to take this course. So you're also, of course, welcome. This course is given every year, at least in theory, and if everything goes well, I'll give it next spring as well. So if you're thinking about postponing it, maybe because you want to take the labor economics course first, which is given in the fall, you can do that, but maybe you want to finish, another reason not to delay taking it. And if you know anybody else in the PhD program that might be interested in this course, please pass that information along. And I just want to show you the outline, so we're on the same page, as it were, thinking about the course. Okay, so I'm taking you through just showing the reading list. You'll get it. You're on your own later. Okay, so these are just readings. There's a very important paper that if you're interested in this course, you should take a look at tonight. Okay, which I think is it's kind of, I found it to be one of the most useful papers I've read on this subject. It was written in 2005 by these guys. So Richard Rogerson, Bob Scheimer, that's the Scheimer puzzle guy, and Randy Wright from Wisconsin. And this is basically a survey article about everything up until 2005 that had been done in this area. And it's a very nice survey, very logical, and I'll be assigning parts of that, and I'll be referring to parts of that. So that's an article you will have to read to get through the course. And I'll take you through several of the derivations that are not explained in the article. So some of the things they do, sort of glibly or not at all, I will take you through in detail. So it's a kind of understanding what these guys do, kind of explaining the entire search and matching approach to the labor market. So this is a very important article. This is also a very nice article which has been published. In the meantime, I didn't get the update on the reference, this one. And there's the book by Pissarides. You don't have to read the whole book, but chapters 1 and 2 are very important. Okay, and the rest of the book is kind of for your edification. Okay, so those are the most important, and this one is also important. Okay, so again, I'm not going to give you a whole lot of reading that you have to do, but I expect you to do what's starred. Okay, that's kind of a good way to proceed. And that's it. Okay, any questions about that? Okay, so today is just an introductory lecture. We'll start by not giving a summary of the last section, but actually giving you a summary of the course. I'm going to talk about labor markets in the static sort of way of looking at them, the way a lot of macroeconomists look at them. And then I'm going to talk about the third way. Okay, the third way would be looking at state transitions and flows in stocks as a way of understanding unemployment. Okay, so this is for some of you, maybe not for others. We talk about matching and frictions. We talk about bringing together people who are looking for jobs and people who are looking to employ people. So that's an alternative way of thinking about it compared to, say, what Professor Hicks back in the 1930s wrote in his book, Theory of Wages, or even before that, Alfred Marshall in his famous book on economics. Economics is the first textbook in economics, really. So I'm going to start talking about a model right away. So this course is about economics, and it's about using models to think about very complicated phenomena. And we're going to use a benchmark model that was introduced by Christopher Pissarides in the 1980s and was picked up by many others. And as you know, Pissarides won a Nobel Prize with Dale Mortensen and Peter Diamond. That's one of the cornerstone things I'll talk about today in this lecture. And we'll move from there to talk about more interesting things. So I'd like to do some administrative stuff before we start. That was supposed to be point 1. This course is given as I said already, once a year. It's part of the cycle, so if you really don't want to specialize in labor, you can take the Advanced Labor Economics course as well. That's given in the fall, and we'll be given this coming fall. There's a lecture today, and there's a section on Friday, and our section leader is Thomas Dengler. So Thomas will be leading the section and reminding you what we did today, and maybe deepening some of your insights, and also giving some problems that would be relevant for the exam. So there are no problem sets per se. There will be problem sets that you can look at and solve in class. But as far as extra credit, basically the entire credit for the course is boiled down to this exam that you'll be taking in July. So that's the way we do it in this course. So it really does behoove you, however, to go to the section and work with Thomas, because Thomas will give you questions that will pretty much essentially appear on the exam. So I will promise you live on television, on internet, that the final exam will be 50% material that is covered in the section. Okay, now the rest has to be your way of creatively applying economics to new situations. That's what economics is supposed to be about. It's supposed to be about thinking and not memorizing. It's supposed to be a way of organizing your thoughts. So we'll keep to that paradigm. Very important for you guys as masters. Come on in. And I want you to please take that seriously with the section. So Fridays at noon in this room. Okay, so that's the plan. So you have lots of spread. You know, last year I gave this myself. I think it's more effective to have someone else doing it. And the nice thing about Thomas is he's pretty smart, so he can raise his hand if he finds that made a mistake. He can correct it, and there's nothing wrong with that. And it puts a little pressure on Thomas as well. Okay. But I'm not going to be doing much writing today. In some of the future lectures, I will actually be taking you through some of the derivations, because some of this stuff is rather, it's challenging, okay? The neat thing about this whole course is it's dealing with labor markets a little bit differently than the way we deal about the market for steel, or for coal, or electricity, or gasoline, or orange juice. There's a lot about labor markets that makes it different. And one of the most important things that makes it different is that it's got an extensive margin. That means that either you're in the job market or you're not, either you're working or you're not, and then given that you're working, you might be working 5 hours, you might be working 20 hours, you might be working 40 hours. That's called the intensive margin. So this course is really mostly about the extensive margin, understanding how to think about unemployment in those terms, and not, I'll explain it in a second, in terms of voluntary withholding of labor from the market. Okay, so that's really a basic point. That's supposed to deflect the criticism that a lot of people who don't know economics would level at us, saying that we don't know how to think about unemployment. It's not true. We do, but it requires a lot of thought. Okay, so think of and I'll get to this in a second. So let me get started with the lecture. This is very general, so this is meant to inspire you. And the hope is that if you're inspired, you'll come back next time and you'll subject yourself to a little bit more challenge and more, interesting stuff, and Thomas, and we'll go from there. But right now I'm just going to talk about some of the central aspects of labor markets that make them different and also make them important. Okay, and these slides will be put online after the lecture always, so you can always get them afterwards. I would encourage you to take a few notes, especially when I start writing stuff longhand, because it's nothing like doing it yourself. You can always come back and check this, and these lectures will be eventually made available online, but not immediately. Okay, so again, challenge to you is to get you to stimulate you to think about this. And one thing I didn't do yet, which I wanted to do at some point, I'll probably do it after I finish inspiring you with the labor markets, is talk about the reading list, because the reading list is online, and we haven't talked about the online access. We use the Moodle system as always. Okay, so I'll get to that in a second. So let me just try to inspire you about this. Okay, so first off, the labor market is arguably the most important market in the economy, in a market economy, even if it's a semi-planned economy, because people do have to obey certain rules in the labor market, just like they do in other markets. We know that if you look at GDP from From the income side, income accruing to factors of production, it's about 2/3 of total GDP, roughly 2/3 of national income. It varies over time, it varies over countries. So it has a lot to do with lots of detail. We think of labor in many different ways. We think about it in hours worked. We also think about it in terms of people. And this course, as I said before, we're thinking of the extensive margin primarily, but every extensive decision has to be supplemented by some positive labor supply. So obviously, if people are working, then new people coming into the market will tend to increase the number of hours worked, as well as people who just increase the number of hours they work per week. So these are two different sides of a coin which involve hours. What firms want your labor supply, and they may want your particular labor supply, or they may want just people working. So there's a lot of different aspects we have to think about. And that's because people's work is different. People have different talents and different aspects, different qualities, and the nature of work is changing over time a lot. Okay, so the famous picture of that I show in my undergraduate class of women working as telephone operators, connecting people trying to call physically. That was a woman's job. It was actually a very important way for women to enter the labor force in the 1900s, 1910s, when telephone exchanges were introduced. Nowadays it's all done by machine. So it's clearly conditioning on the technology is essential, because the way people behave and the way people work conditions the demand for labor. Okay, so again, you're probably interested in this because you like economics, you like labor economics. We have this issue of the extensive margin. People who are not working, what are they doing? Okay, are they working in the underground economy? Are they really genuinely searching for a job? Or are they being choosy? It could be even a mixture of those. And all these things matter. And of course, people get very political about it because it involves people's ability to earn a living and to exist in a market economy. So it's obvious that people would get emotional about this, and we need to separate our emotions a little bit from our understanding of the way economics works. We also know that unemployment moves around a lot. So I'll define it in a second. There's movement over time, and there's movement as you move across national boundaries, even as you move across the borders of Bundesländer. Okay, so there's a lot of aspects of this extensive margin that we're going to care about, and we also care about how people, why people's hours of work are desired. So these women operators, which now are both men and women working in call centers with very sophisticated technology. Back then it was just literally pulling plugs out of holes and putting them in other holes. This type of demand for labor has to be understood. Why do firms need people to do this sort of stuff? So we need to think about the use of labor, and then we think about the production function. Okay, so this again, macroeconomics comes into play, also microeconomics. We think of an economy organized around value added, and value added is an accretion to the value of inputs that are purchased, and capital is responsible and labor is responsible in some way, and this technical relationship above is part of what our story would be in a traditional setting. Okay, so we talked about the passion behind unemployment and labor markets. It's kind of carrying through to this course. So we're going to have to start by thinking about something really, really central to macroeconomics and also to economics applied to politics, which is the question of what unemployment is. So I'm going to start with just asking you to give me a definition, because I know a lot of you have taken my course, or Lutz Weinke's course. Maybe you didn't talk about it in the master's program, but you certainly talked about it as an undergraduate. So who wants to tell me what unemployment is? I give you a hint. How about the ILO definition, the International Labor Office definition? Yeah.
People that are actively looking for a job but cannot find one.
Okay, that's really very good. So you have to be a bit more precise, because it actually depends on the period. you've looked for a job sometime in your life. It really depends on the last, say, N weeks, and it's usually 4. And what does it mean to look for a job? It means you have to spend some time. So you have to spend some measure of time. It can be a couple of hours or a couple of minutes. Every country has a little bit of a twist on this. Nowadays it's very easy to go online and look for a job, right? Some of you might be using InStaff, and you just get an email, and then you just, if you want, you click on it. So you're always looking in some sense. Okay. And the question is, if you take that seriously, that means that people are actually trying to find a job. They're not just sitting around. Okay, and they actually have a desire to work under the conditions that the economy is giving. So the question that arises next is it a problem? Is it a problem to have unemployment? I wish there were a completely, unanimous answer to this. It's an unequivocal answer. So anybody have a comment? For example, I'll give you an example. Berlin has one of the highest unemployment rates in Germany right now. I just found that out today, actually. Okay, how can that be? This place is humming, right? If you want a job, you can probably get one.
But it seems like not the right one for the right person.
Right, so there may be some view that, I got my degree at the Humboldt University, I don't want to necessarily go work at McDonald's right now. It might be a good idea if I'm really desperate, but I think I can do better. And if I think I can do better, maybe I should try to do better. Some people may not have that degree and may have limited options. So that's the most important thing is, again, heterogeneity of agents and also this heterogeneity of options. And not knowing everything at once. Okay, so not being able to know exactly what you could be doing means that the economy may be using unemployment as a mechanism, or it may be the byproduct of a mechanism that's trying to sift out and match people to the right options. Okay, so this was very controversial 50 years ago. People who promoted this type of logic were roundly condemned as heartless economists, starting with Milton Friedman, Robert Lucas, and nowadays people accept this as being true. Even the left-wing economists think this is true. Okay, the question is why, and can we do something to change that? Can we improve? Do we care about distribution of options and alternatives? Okay, so again, my view is kind of Lionel Robbins. We should try to diagnose things first before we pass judgment, and therefore take a look at this picture. Okay, so we have unemployment rates measured in the ILO way. Presumably, I'm not so sure the Swiss were using the ILO standards back in the 90s and before, but clearly you see a rank ordering. So you see the average level in one country or set of countries being lower or higher for persistent periods of time. You see trends, you see fluctuations. All these things are kind of what matter. You have a fluctuation part, that's the business cycle, but if you took a filter to that and applied some moving average, you'd certainly conclude that the Swiss have a lower unemployment than the United States throughout the entire period. And what does that mean? Does that mean that the Swiss are more efficient? Does it mean that their workers have flexible wages? Or does that mean that they're very, very well matched to the job opportunities that are available? These are completely open questions. So we should have an open mind, and we should try to think really hard about it in different ways. I think of this like a Picasso painting, with the cubist perspective, or just you get this flat image with lots of different perspectives. So think of the labor market as being sort of represented by different ways, and this is the first one. This is Marshall, the neoclassical perspective. Okay, and then we'll talk about the other ones in a second. So, how would you characterize the neoclassical perspective? If you had to say a few things, yeah.
The classical supply and demand diagram, and there's no unemployment.
Right, so the two important things. First off, labor supply, labor demand. So there's an implicit, I hear, competition. Workers are taking the wages given, firms are taking the wages given. Nobody can manipulate the market. You don't have any trade unions. You don't have any employers associations. You don't have any monopsonists. Okay, so these are really important assumptions. In the day of Marshall, probably more reasonable than today. Yeah, so if we do that, then we think of this. We think of labor supply and labor demand. Okay, so we can think about labor supply. Who supplies the labor? Households, right? So individual households or individual people, and basically they're thinking, how can I make myself best as possible given what I can get? So again, you're assuming the wage is given. That's the slope of this budget constraint. And you've got basically an endowment of time, and this time is L bar, and you don't have any wealth in this particular representation. So basically, if you don't work at all, you're not going to have much to eat. So if you work a little bit, you can have more to eat. And again, the trade-off between your free time and income or consumption is basically the slope of that line with a minus sign in front of it. Okay, so the real wage is the angle or the ratio of the rise over the run of that budget constraints. That's really easy. We learn that in micro. Okay, so you can think about these three examples of the difference curves. We can't get to the blue line, so that represents a level of happiness or satisfaction that's just out of reach for us. And then we have the pink line, the pink indifference curve, which would represent points that are just inferior to anything on the orange, and the orange is actually attainable. We can get that happy. These indifference curves represent happiness. These sort of utility combinations of consumption and leisure, because we like both. We'd like to have more of both, and we want to go up to the right. And choosing that point represented here is just the best we can do. So this is a kind of a view that people optimize, try to do the best they can, and you may reject that, but it's a good starting position. You can criticize it later and say, but again, microeconomics tells us this is where we want to start, and therefore that gives us the labor supply behavior of a household, because I can change the slope of the line, and I can trace through different combinations of leisure and consumption that people choose. So that gives us a labor supply curve. And under a lot of fairly standard assumptions, we'll get something that's upward sloping. Could be negatively sloped. And if you take my other course, we'll talk about that, because maybe a wage increase actually does such good stuff for you that you want to take more leisure. Okay, that would be the backward bending case. But for the average behavior of an economy, we're going to take this as kind of being narrow. So upward sloping labor supply curve. It could also be vertical. Maybe each individual household has a certain has preferences that give rise to an inelastic supply of labor. Okay, you can aggregate this up. So this is an individual. We can also add them up. So you might, if you add up a lot of people, you're going to aggregate horizontally because the wage is the same, and you get a supply curve that's positively sloped, more likely to have some positive slope if people are different. So you can think of this as the individual representative person, or you can think of it as an integral, or the summation of a lot of different people with different similar behavior. Okay, so we can have different people. At the low end, we might have a lot of people who really don't care about free time and just want to make lots of money. And then at the upper time, you might have people who are really choosy. Okay, it's neoclassical labor supply theory. And there's a lot you can do with that. Okay, so I say this, repeat this all the time. If you look at the behavior across countries, you see huge differences. Right? Americans work like crazy, and they have since the 1970s. Back in the 1970s, the US and France and Germany were quite similar. And then after that, they sort of separated. And if you want to learn about that, you can think about, you can take my course in the fall. We spend more time talking about that, but it's kind of strange, isn't it? In fact, it's also strange that the United Kingdom and Sweden look a lot like the United States. Okay, so you think Sweden, that's a high-tax country, how's that? Right? So these are the things economics get us excited about. You also look at Germany and France, they look almost identical. So there is kind of something very, very similar to those two regions. And you add in Italy, Italy doesn't look much better. I have an update on this. I'll put on the next slide. It's in the other course. Okay. So again, the way we explain it's using neoclassical economics is that okay, maybe there are different people working at different times in their life. Maybe Sweden has a very high retirement age. Maybe Sweden has policies that promote females' participation in the market, which they do. They make it cheap to get child care. These are all things that would help us explain the Marshallian approach to thinking about this. Again, extensive versus intensive margin. And I told you already, we were really concerned not with the first part, but the second part, the extensive margin. So if you're interested in the other stuff, like how much women work versus men in different countries, and that would be useful. It'd be useful for you to take that course in the fall. Okay. Now, firms demand labor. They demand hours, but they also demand the people that deliver the hours. And Marshall told us the weird thing about labor markets is the people are attached to the hours. You can't separate it. And so you show up to work, it's you. So the employer may like you or may not like you. That may affect her attitude towards you, but that's the way it is. Okay? But the firm wants hours because the firm uses the hours of your work to make money for them. And then we have this really simple neoclassical explanation of the way firms think. Right? Firms are trying to maximize profits. And they have a production function, this pink line, and then there's this kind of, if you think about the same W that workers are getting paid, something related to that, those costs increase with the number of hours they employ, and then basically the firms will just try to maximize the difference between this pink production function and this R total cost function, again, assuming all of the costs are not relevant for us right now. And then you basically, that distance is maximized at point A. It's the point where the slope of that production function is exactly equal to the slope of this cost curve. Marginal cost equals marginal product. So it's really simple stuff. And that would give rise to this curve, which effectively traces out the marginal product of labor. Okay? And that thing is conditioned on a position of the production function. Shift the production function, you shift the marginal product of labor. So the neoclassical story is really simple. Okay? Basically, we have this. And like Toby said, basically, you have market clearing. So this is market to start with, and this is after I shift the demand curve because I think something happened in the economy. The economy has an increase in productivity of labor, which makes labor more desirable at all wages. Okay, so it's because of a change in export prices for an open economy. It could be because of other factors. And that has a lot of power. It's a very powerful prediction. Shifting labor's demand is correlated with labor hours and real wages. They're both positively correlated. And it's a very powerful prediction of Marshall. That's why the Marshall framework is still surviving even though we have this course. All the stuff that we do in this course challenges this, but it's still, if you think about it, it's still a very useful way of proceeding. And you can also have supply shifts. So a supply shift would be exactly the kind of change that would induce a negative correlation between between the price of labor and the quantity of labor actually used and supplied by the market. Okay, so that's the first story. I think it's about 2/3 of what's going on. We're interested in some other part. We want to understand unemployment because Toby said there's no unemployment in this picture. I mean, you could try to dream it up. You could say, well, I can imagine. You could imagine the distance between A in this direction between some maximum supplyable number of hours. That could be unemployment, but that's not what we think of when we think of unemployment. That's the number of hours people withhold from the market because the wage is not high enough to get them to do it. Okay, so you can imagine if you raise wages, positive labor supply, you'd have less voluntary unemployment. Okay. So what's the first way of getting unemployment into this picture? If you don't want to call it voluntary, it has to be involuntary. Right? And how would you, if you wanted just to force unemployment into this picture, how would you do that? Yeah.
Maybe by reduction of the labor demand of the firms.
Okay, but if you did that, if you started at point A and you reduced labor demand, we'd be here. I mean, it'd be kind of like going from there to there. You'd still have voluntary employment and voluntary unemployment. So but you're close, yeah.
You need some sort of rigidity, so the wage has to stay the same even though you have a demand shift.
Okay, you have to have something keeping the wage from adjusting. So that was the response actually to the crisis in the UK in the 1920s and the whole world in the 1930s to rising unemployment. They said, well, wages aren't adjusting fast enough. Must be that. Okay, so you can basically assume that the wages don't clear the market. That was we call non-Walrasian explanation. Because Walras was the famous economist. I guess he was from Switzerland, spoke French, something like that. Basically, his idea was the wage solves this system of equations and basically everything's fine. Labor supply equals demand. If it doesn't happen, for some reason, maybe there's some rigidity. So it doesn't have to be perfectly rigid. It could be also just a little bit rigid, but not exactly the way households want to behave. You have to have some wedge between what the households want to do and what the market would yield. So the extreme thing is this picture. So you have an extreme rigid real wage, maybe because there's a minimum wage. It's kind of unlikely that minimum wage would be binding for everybody, but it could be unions, right? It could be labor unions, it could be a regulation. Maybe the employers have a rule. They don't want to compete with each other. All sorts of possibilities. Okay, so there you see unemployment is quite obvious, right? It's the distance between labor supply and labor demand. Because workers at that wage, they want to work where they want to work. The intersection of the red bar with the pink line and what firms actually want to demand at that given that wage is much less. So that distance between LS and LD is exactly unemployment. Okay, this is basic stuff, but again, it's going to get complicated in a second. So we already have two interpretations of unemployment. Right? We already have two, and this course is about the third interpretation. Why is it important? It's important because both of those other interpretations have a problem dealing with two things. One is the interpretation of unemployment as being voluntary or involuntary, and the other is the observation that even in situations where there is unemployment, there are vacancies. People are looking for workers. Okay, so even if we thought this were an accurate characterization of the world, there shouldn't be any vacancies, because everyone who is posting a job will get a huge source of applicants, and he can just pick whoever he wants. And the models are all the same, so it shouldn't matter anyway. You just have a lot of people who are unemployed. So this can't be the problem. There has to be something else going on. Right? So again, just to review, and this is a response to the changes we observed in the world. So the Pigou was one of the people who actually said, Marshall, great, but maybe we should think a bit more deeply about this and allow wages not to adjust. So you can imagine this is sort of a representation of how to think about what happens when you have rigid wages. Okay, so that would be the right-hand panel, and the left-hand panel is you have clearing markets. And if you can imagine what would happen if the supply curve were to shift out in both cases. When the first case, drop in wages, increase in employment. In the second case, a shift downwards in the wage would cause a reduction in labor supply because fewer people would be interested in looking at those bad wages, despite a reduction in wages. So this is kind of a contradiction. And I think, we have to go back to this definition and ask, okay, well, these people are looking, they're not finding work, we have to change our framework for thinking about that. Okay, so I'm gonna take you, I'm gonna skip this so we get to the most important thing. So we're talking about the unsatisfactory aspect of both of these approaches. And, the best way of thinking about this is that when you talk to a person who's unemployed, and we can do that, you find that they're not happy. Okay, so that's a fact. You can look at their happiness scale, their response to certain survey questions, and you can also look at their behavior and what they're doing with their free time. So that may indicate they may be enjoying more leisure. Okay, so it's not like they're spending all their time hitting the pavement. They have some reason for maybe withholding some of their time for other activities. There's a very interesting study on German unemployment that looks at people's allocation of time using real data on what people do when they're unemployed. So both of these explanations are unsatisfactory. So the way we're going to try to get around this, is to think about frictions that prevent supply and demand, however defined, from sort of being equilibrated. Okay, so that's why we talk about search and matching. So we talk about frictions, anything that prevents this equilibration of demand and supply. So I'm just going to make some appeal to the recent data to give you some inspiration on this. I'm going to look at the United States. This is the U.S. Before the financial crisis and after the financial crisis. We had obviously there's a lot of, the U.S. is a country where there's a lot of mobility. People move around a lot. There's also a lot of fluctuations in the unemployment rate. There's a lot of fluctuations in employment, and there's a lot of fluctuation in the intensity in which people find jobs. So these are going to help us understand what's coming. This is not just behavior of the short term. So you could take the view, well, maybe a lot of this is just pure friction. People will just, in a recession, the market just can't handle it, but it does handle it fairly quickly. So we can go back to Marshall. If you look at long-term unemployment, and when I say long-term unemployment, I mean people who've been unemployed for more than, say, 12 months, you actually get a very similar picture. Okay, so there is this view that we have to take seriously, is that long-term unemployment also can move. It can move quite a bit, and it also returns to equilibrium at a certain rate. And I haven't updated this, but if you do so, the long-term unemployment rate is now in the United States quite low. It's actually about as low as it was in the 1990s. So this is a fantastic experiment for us to look at. And what are those people doing? Who are they? Are they mostly, white old men? Are they women? Are they minorities? What kind of shifts are we observing in the data? Okay, so we're going to use that insight to think about the labor markets with friction in a lot more detail for the rest of the hour that we have at our disposal. Okay, so the way to do this is to think about dynamics. So we're thinking about discrete changes of people's states. Now this unemployment rate that we looked at before in the United States, this one or this one, is based on a survey. It's based on people asking a lot of individuals in the United States, 100,000 individuals, every month, what did they do last week? Were they working? If they weren't working, were they looking for a job? If they weren't looking for a job, why? Maybe were they in education, or were they retired, or lots of different possibilities. Okay, just goofing off, it's all okay, right? It's just and what we notice is there's a lot of fluctuation across the states, and thinking about that in a serious way is kind of what motivates this course. Okay, so at a fundamental level, this discreteness of labor will immediately lead us to thinking about the labor market like this. Okay, so we'll use some math in a second, but the idea is simply this is the first simplification. Okay, because in fact there are at least 3 labor market states. But in the first instance, you have people could be working, they could be not working. Okay, so this is not a bad approximation. If you just say, I'm going to look at people who are of working age, and I'm going to ignore the people who are out of the labor force, it's probably okay. If you really want to do a super serious analysis, you're not going to get very far. But this captures a lot of what we're interested in, and we might even forget about the quits to other jobs. So we'll forget about that too. We'll just make it very simple. And And the quits to other jobs are very important even in countries where you wouldn't think so. I mean, even in Europe, a lot of people are, especially young people, are very mobile. They move from one job to the next. They don't ever become unemployed because maybe they got a good run, they have a nice job, and they can use that to get a CV that looks better when they apply for the next job. It's kind of the way people work, get a nice letter of recommendation, Arbeitszeugnis, whatever. And that's why the first model for today, which will motivate next week, is a model of the unemployment that involves stocks and flows. Okay, so we'll think of the entire sum of people who are unemployed like a bathtub. Okay, and the level of water in the bathtub is the unemployment that we observe, the number of unemployed people. And you remember how a bathtub works? You turn on the water comes into the bathtub, and you pull the plug, water leaves the bathtub. Okay? But the magic thing is that you can always play around with it. Next time you take a bath, you can play with it. There's always a combination of leaving the drain open and letting water come in, where the water is completely constant. It's not magic. It's just kind of it's like a differential equation with a restriction imposed on the stock. Okay, or maybe it's a solution to the differential equation, you call it that. So that's kind of what we're thinking about doing. So for your entertainment, for those of you who haven't taken this course before, I always show this because I did this myself. This is a bathtub. And so we're going to, again, just to introduce the math really slowly, I'm going to motivate, we use the symbol U to measure, to stand for unemployment. So capital U would be the number of people unemployed, and little u would be the unemployment rate as a fraction of the labor force. And the labor force is the sum of the people who are working and the people who are not working, because we're still in this world, okay? Later on we can add out of the labor force. Okay, so then you have, it's really easy. We can, this is where it gets a little tricky. I'm not going to look, we'll try it. So, if we think of L bar as the total number of people in the economy, and we have L and we have U, okay? Basically, we're talking about two different state transitions. That's all we need to make this thing work. We're actually asking what is the rate of change of unemployment. And you can use a difference equation. You have to use a differential equation. You can use a difference equation. So we can say, okay, so what's the change of unemployment in a period of time? It's got to be the difference between the gross inflows and the gross outflows. So I'll write that out. Okay, so how do we want to think about those flows? Well, in a trivial accounting sense, we could think of the inflows as being a fraction of those who have jobs. Okay? And we could think of outflows as a fraction of those people who don't have jobs. Really simple, just to get a lot of you are coming from maybe non-economic backgrounds, or at least you haven't seen this stuff in a while, so let's just try it, right? This is really super simple. So we think of, just define little s as being the rate of inflow into unemployment given that you're employed. And then F is the rate of outflow. So these are like mechanical numbers, mechanical rates, and our idea in economics is to try to put life into these rates, but right now we're just asking when the bathtub is level, then this has to be equal to 0. Okay. So that's really not very deep. Okay, so what I'd like to do now is eliminate L by substituting, using the identity for the definition for the total labor force, which is the sum of unemployed people and the unemployed people. So we get something like S times L bar minus U minus F times U. And I'm going to set this equal to 0. Okay. And then I'm going to divide the entire equation by L bar, because L bar is a constant. In fact, I could set it equal to 1 if I wanted Okay, so I do that. It simplifies pretty easy because you know that U over L bar is equal to little u, the unemployment rate. Okay, so we have F times U. And here we have 1 minus little u because L divided by L bar divided by L bar is equal to 1. So it's 1 minus u times S minus that equals 0. And then you just have to solve for u. So what is u? S divided by S plus F. So this bathtub version of the economy, of the labor market, gives us a very simple answer. And you can answer any question using this. It may not be a well-posed question, but if you have flows and they're equilibrated, it's going to be kind of a race between the inflows and the outflows. So we can use that formula to derive the equilibrium rate of unemployment in a matching economy. We'll do that later on in the second hour, and we might even get to it in the first hour, probably not. Okay, so you can see already that ceteris paribus, an increase in the inflow rate is going to raise the unemployment rate, and an increase in the outflow rate is going to decrease the unemployment rate. Okay, and that's exactly what I have in this funky diagram there. Okay, so that's a really simple way of getting, and again, we're going to try to breathe life into these objects. We're going to try to explain what makes F work. Why do people leave unemployment? Is it purely random? If it were purely random, this is a perfect characterization. If everyone's the same in the bathtub and the probability of finding a job is identical across agents, then it's the same. And if S is independent of any variables I tend or want to mention, then this is a fine characterization. And even if it's not, we can still think that in terms of an identity. I'll show you an example. Countries and regions that have high inflow rates will tend to have higher unemployment rates. Okay, so if you look at Spain, for example, Spain has a really high unemployment rate. People always complain about Spain, but actually Spain has had a high unemployment rate since Franco. And why does it have a high unemployment rate? Because they have a very large agricultural economy. And agricultural economies have lots of people flowing in and out of unemployment. Right? Because it's a seasonal thing. Okay? And they also have a large underground economy, which also matters. All these things matter. If you look at Sweden, for example, very different story. If you look at London, okay, so you expect those unemployment rates to reflect that, but also reflect the willingness of people to accept jobs. Again, we haven't tried to explain that, but if that's characterized by an exogenous F, then that would be a very interesting theory indeed. Yes?
Shouldn't it be SL minus FU? Inflows minus outflows?
Yeah, it should be. Should be, stand corrected. Yeah, it kind of came out here at the end. So I was correcting myself. Thanks. Any questions about that? So this is like a really baby theory of, it's where we want to go. And the Pissarides model that I'm going to show you in a second actually does a very nice job of putting some life into this. Okay, so Pissarides, the famous Chris Pissarides, Sir Chris Pissarides, his model is about explaining F. Okay, not so much S. And after we do the Pissarides model, we'll do another model that actually tries to explain both of these, S and F. Okay, so this is kind of a, let's take a look at the data. I mean, you might think this is all kind of a bunch of formulas that don't make much sense. I mean, this is just to show you that even in a country like Germany, where you think everything's running fine, and actually in 2006 things didn't look so good in Germany actually. And you can see that it's kind of reflected in the numbers. I mean, the stock of unemployment in Germany, the average stock over the year 2006 was about 4.5 million people, and there were 6.9 million inflows into unemployment. Now, some of those people were the same people doing it many times. Okay, that's a fact. But these are numbers from the Statistisches Bundesamt. Okay, so it's kind of it's got to be true. And you also see that in that same year, more than 7.4 million people, or cases of unemployment were deregistered. 7.4 million cases of exits from unemployment. Ausgänge aus der Arbeitslosigkeit. So obviously during that period, unemployment was falling in Germany. That's when the Hartz reforms started to get implemented, and a lot of people were leaving to get jobs maybe they didn't like so much, but they did. And again, so these numbers are gross numbers. These are these numbers, right? So probably not so informative. You have to divide by the size of the population, the economy, or the labor force to make it more meaningful. That's why the United States, it looks very impressive. It's a big economy, so you have to make the appropriate adjustment. Actually, in that year, the U.S. economy looked pretty good. Okay, so as a rate of inflow, it was actually pretty low. Okay, any questions about that? That's pretty basic stuff. I mentioned the fact that there can be regional variation in these inflow rates. I talked about Spain versus Sweden, but actually, you look at this picture, you see that, unfortunately, I don't have any super modern, up-to-date data, but in 2004, it's just an example, you can see that these small variations in the inflow rate make a big difference in terms of the unemployment rate. So this is a good time to be in the UK, but obviously if you're in the north, or you're in Wales, or Northern Ireland, the unemployment rate is higher because, among other things, just numerically, the inflow rate was higher for whatever reasons. Okay, so you have to keep that in mind. Okay, this is an update for those people who are interested in Germany. You can see that this is, again, really interesting. So we have a lower stock of unemployment. We have an even higher rate of inflows as measured in absolute terms, not normalized. So this is kind of a byproduct of a churning labor market. A lot of people are also in temporary work, so they enter unemployment more rapidly or more frequently. And they may also be going into training or leaving training at a faster rate. Okay, so there's a lot of things involved. And that gives me a reason to expand our picture, because before we just had 2 states. Now we'll think more critically, we might want to actually add a state. So we want to think about people who are actually out of the labor force. Okay, so this would include people who have retired, people who have entered training, they may be in school, they may have quit and decided to pull out for a while and just do something else. Some people can afford to do that. Sometimes having children or change in the family can be quite dramatic change for labor supply, so it's a normal response. So you can see lots of different motivations, and you can see some of you may actually leave the university and leave university and go right into a job. So you don't have to pass through unemployment. And there may be reasons not to pass through unemployment. There was a time when it didn't matter much. Now it may be seen as a bad sign or a blemish on your career, so you try really hard to avoid it. Again, I'm not saying it's good or bad, it's just the way it is. Okay, so those transitions in labor markets are very important. And you can use this framework, you can add these transitions to get even more complicated expressions for unemployment rates and for the out of the labor force rate. I'm going to make the argument, which I think Pisarides also makes, which is that the transitions from unemployed to out of the labor force are very small. Okay, so people do get discouraged, but it's a very small fraction compared to those people moving right and left. And the same goes for people who retire. Okay, so there aren't that many people being born in Germany anyway, and even if you include the immigration numbers, it's not that much. Okay, so most of the action is the top 2 states. But you can use all 3 states, and you can, like the OECD makes estimates of the equilibrium rate of unemployment. I already derived an equilibrium rate of unemployment in the 2-state case. This is kind of what a lot of macroeconomists get interested in and think about sometimes it's called the natural rate of unemployment. We won't talk about necessarily whether it's natural or whether it's good, but it's certainly equilibrium. So now let's get into the meat of today's discussion. I'm going to try to motivate one way of thinking about F, and it basically goes back to these guys. So this is just, again, to give you an idea of what these guys look like, or looked like. So Pissarides is on the right, Peter Diamond's on the left, and Dale Mortenson's in the middle. Dale Mortenson passed away a few years ago, so he's no longer with us. Incredible contributions on all three of them. They all worked, to some sense, on the same stuff. They didn't always work together. Diamond has worked on other things as well. So it's the duo that we will spend a lot of time with is between Pissarides and Mortenson, which gives rise to a modification of the first model I'm going to discuss today and next week. Okay. So let's try to motivate this. Try to motivate how we're going to think about this. Okay, so you think about these people leaving unemployment. They leave it for a reason. All right, so they've found something, and you can say, well, how can it be that they can't find something? All right, so this is an interesting problem. And I'm going to try to use this to develop the idea of what a friction is. Okay, friction is something that prevents you from going straight to the goal. So you see the job over there, you see that guy working there, and he leaves the job and you want to have that job. Okay? And why can't you get it? That's kind of what this problem is about. I'm going to try to motivate it in a very simple way. Later on we'll use search, we'll actually develop a version of search theory, which means you have to describe very carefully what the person's objective is and what the person wants to accomplish, and then you have to ask, what can the person do? Can the person, what's the choice space? What's the choice set that the person has at their disposal? So this problem that we're going to think about today, we're going to think about the job finding rate is an example of search, and it need not be one-sided. It can be two-sided. Okay, but we'll start just by thinking about what everyone in Berlin thinks about now. If you already have an apartment, that's great, but maybe you're not so happy with it and looking for another one. Maybe you've just moved to Berlin and you have nothing. You're staying with a friend's house. You Airbnb. It's very expensive. So okay, but this is clearly, you might know of people who have apartments, and you might know abstractly there are apartments out there. There's something preventing you from getting it. Okay, so it could be any number of things. But I'm going to try to motivate using lots of examples. Then we can talk about concrete things. What is preventing you from getting that apartment? Okay, because it's not a trivial point. Okay, so when you're driving a car or you have a motorcycle and you're driving. I lived in Paris for a while. Finding a parking space is a non-trivial problem, and you know there are parking spaces there, and you can pay for them. They cost a lot of money. Okay, or you can just keep on driving around. Back then it was easier because they can make you buy a permit, and it was easier for me anyway. So it didn't cost anything, but you had to invest time. All right, so you had to spend a lot of time driving around. I coming home from work, I would commute in the opposite direction. So I actually lived in Paris and worked in Fontainebleau. So I would drive in, and I was driving against the traffic, so I felt I felt great seeing all these cars cruise by. When I get to Paris, no cars in the street, but there are also no parking spaces. So you're basically waiting for someone to leave. And obviously, if I'm really desperate, I can park in the next arrondissement and walk, or take the metro, but that's kind of unsatisfactory. So I was trying to drive around my neighborhood, around my apartment, to keep driving, and then eventually someone would actually get up and leave. Someone would get in their car and drive away, and I would have to fight somebody else to get it. So that's a great example. Think about the friction involved there, as opposed to the one involved in the first one. Think about, you get into this club and you don't know anybody. What's your strategy, right? You just want to go out and just dance on the floor. You don't care about anything. You just want to dance. Okay. There are lots of different strategies Again, it's a similar type of thing. And then, of course, obviously, looking for a job is in that class of models. It's got to be in that class of problems. So, what is the common? Are there any common aspects of these problems that you'd like to talk about? So, I want to get some feedback from you. What are the common aspects here? I mean, I always put the Berghain thing in to get people excited. So who wants to try? What are the interesting things going on in these that are common to these four problems?
Maybe more people are interested in some specific apartments, parking spaces, or jobs, or I don't know. And like, for example, if you look at Google, everybody wants to work at Google, but nobody wants to work at some lame small firm, even though there's like probably the same pay.
Okay.
Just because it's Google.
Okay. So that means that we're choosy. Okay. So the one side of the market is choosy. That's a great point. So you might not want to live in Hohenschönhausen or live in Brandenburg somewhere. You could probably get an apartment there quickly, I think. Maybe you'd rather live in Friedrichshain. Actually, people don't want to live there anymore, but Neukölln, you may have really high standards. Okay? So in economics, we say you have a high reservation price. We'll talk about that in detail later. But that's part of it, certainly. Reservation price. So let's now just assume that everyone's the same. So we all have the same desire, and we're not really choosy. Okay, so again, you're right, but we can make it even less complicated by just saying everyone has the same taste. So it's kind of a, we're all in the club looking around. What do you think? Yeah.
Lack of like centralized information to match.
Yeah.
Matching.
Great. Okay, so there's a lack of information. Yeah. So maybe if we had, there used to be a club, Klärchens Ballhaus. It still exists actually, but it used to have telephones. So, and this is in the GDR days. You could go, and I actually went in there right after the walk-in, and you could go in there and sit down at a table, and there's a telephone, and it worked. And you could call people at different tables. Right? So you could actually just. It was easier to get information whether these people are actually interested or not. Okay? So, but more technically, you could say that the lack of overall information. You may not know how many people are in the club. You may not know how many people who are interested in you or potentially are in the club. You may not know how many apartments are out there, and you may not know how many parking spaces are available, literally. So when I would go to Paris, I didn't know. On a weekend, it was impossible to park. But on a weekday, on Monday or Tuesday, it was great. It's a lot of. So you have to kind of know the market a little bit, and you may learn about the market. So what else? Anybody else? So Diamond and Pissarides and Mortensen got, especially Pissarides, but all three of them got a prize, the prize, for one particular aspect of this problem. So what determines your success at Berghain? Okay, let's restrict ourselves to, actually let's change this. Let's look at apartments. What would affect your success probability in finding an apartment? It's true of all of them. I just didn't want to get into details of Berghain. It can get quite interesting. But if you're looking for an apartment, what determines your success probability? If everyone's the same, all the apartments are the same, no choosiness.
Maybe your financial background?
No, you're all the same.
The amount of time you applied for the apartment.
No, but that's also both true. These guys are both right, but everyone's the same. No.
How well you can acquire information about vacant apartments, but if everyone is the same, everyone has the same matching function. So.
Exactly.
If there are enough apartments for everyone.
Okay, so it's the relative number of people on both sides of the market. It's the number of apartments versus the number of searchers. That's what I wanted to hear from you. Okay, so it's the relative supply of offers and demanders, or suppliers and demanders, or searchers on both sides of the market. The key thing that those guys pointed out is that the ratio of unemployed to vacancies, or vacancies to unemployed, or number of cars looking for a parking space as opposed to the number of free parking spaces, that ratio matters. Okay, so that's a really deep insight. That means that it means your success probability depends on what everybody else is doing. Okay? So in addition to incomplete information, and somebody else said two-sided, choosiness, it involves externalities. That's what I want to tell you today. Okay? It means that my success in looking for an apartment depends on everyone else being in the market. Okay? So if I was the only person in the market, or there are only few people like me looking for an apartment, and we're all the same, my chances of getting one is higher than if the entire world is looking for an apartment, relative to the number of apartments. Okay, so that's the key insight of the search and matching at the very, very first level is just this idea of externalities. And their externality means my behavior affects other people's well-being, economic well-being outside the market. It's not compensated. Okay, that's the important thing. I don't get, if I'm looking for a job, I don't have to pay somebody. If I'm at the club, I don't have to pay. Maybe you have to pay the guy at the door, but you don't have to pay, for being an active searcher. That's kind of the fundamental idea. So that involves an externality. Okay, so again, if I'm in Paris looking for that parking space, if I'm the only car, if everyone's on vacation, then it's going to be really easy for me. Because it means other cars are looking around too. Basically, if the guy passes the free space before I do, he's going to take it. So that means that the ratio of total people in the market will affect my chances. Okay, so that's a key idea. That's what Peter Diamond talked about in his famous coconut paper in 1982, which nobody reads anymore, but it's very, very interesting. You can also extend this to many other different ways of studying the problem. The idea is that trading, your success of trading depends on the availability of other people. Diamond was actually thinking about expectations as well and other things, but it's the same idea. Okay, and if you take it through the tradition of labor and search, Milton Friedman talked about it, and you can see it in the data. Okay, so this is kind of what I like to show people. This is the UK. This is a plot of vacancy rates and unemployment rates. Okay, so this is a great example. Okay, if in the sort of just before the financial crisis, there was a lot of vacancies in the UK, and there were a lot of people looking for jobs. And you wonder what's going on here. What could be causing them not to match? You can see, if you look carefully at this, over the business cycle, the movement is mostly from the northwest to the southeast and back again. And that looks like the business cycle. So in good times, vacancies go up, unemployment goes down. Bad times, unemployment goes up, vacancies go down. But the curve, this beverage curve, seems to be moving sometimes. And this is Germany. Okay, so Germany looked like a really stable beverage curve when it was West Germany, and then you had unification. And now, recently, if you update that, it looks even better. But it looks like a different curve now. So in a sense, that's kind of what Mortensen and Pisseries and Diamond talked about, is the way the presence of other people who are unemployed in the market affect unemployed people's chances of finding jobs. And that's what we're going to try to formalize in the course of the rest of the hour. I only got like 15 minutes left, but I'll get started on it, and then if you still want to come back and listen to it, I'll show you the Pisseries model, and you can look at it yourself. It's on the readings. Here's the U.S. These are similar measures. They're not exactly the same, so you can say, well, it's because of measurement, but actually the U.S. looks more like the beverage curve hasn't changed very much, whereas the Germans, man, they're just, the Germans tend to be very organized and stable, but there have been some changes. The first jump was the oil crisis in the I think it was the second maybe the second oil crisis, but the first one might have been, I have to check this, you have to count the dots. But starting in 1960, you can see that a lot of the motion seems to be along a curve, but occasionally you have these shifts outward. And that would, those shifts have something to do with the efficiency at which labor markets match unemployed people and vacancies. Okay? And the same is true of the UK and the US. Let me just try to make that really clear by looking at the US in detail. So the US had the Great Recession, and here's some data. Okay, so we see that in the Great Recession, this little s jumped a lot. Okay, so remember, look carefully at this formula. Okay, so s is a small number. In Germany, it's a number like maybe 1% per month or something. Maybe even smaller now. It's probably much smaller actually. It's probably more like 0.5% per month. Because unemployment is big, and multiply a big number by a small number, you can still get lots of flows. If S goes up by 50%, that's a lot. That has a lot of effect. Holding F constant means that U goes up a lot. Much more so than F. F is a bigger number than S because U is a smaller number, right? So again, it's just math. So over the cycle, we see F moving a lot, the inflows and outflows into unemployment, but this is usually associated with structural change. S is something that, moving from an agricultural to an industrial economy or to a service economy would mean that S goes down, for example. Okay, or, the United States, the Great Recession was associated by the collapse of a lot of very important industries that had very low inflow and outflow rates. One of those was finance, real estate, the famous real estate crisis, and a large chunk of manufacturing. So that made S go up in the first instance because it was a one-off change, but little s is kind of remained at an elevated level for a while. It's come down a little bit, and F went down. So the frequency of finding jobs goes down. So look what happens to unemployment. I mean, literally more than doubles over the period of, say, 6 quarters. Okay, so this kind of looks like structural change, and if you look at the data, that's kind of what you see. These red dots, this comes from a paper by Vincent Sturck at the UCL, shows that in these last periods of the beginning of the Great Recession, there's a big deviation from the usual pattern we call the beverage curve. Okay, so let me introduce the Pissarides idea. And we're not going to get anywhere close to finishing, but we'll get some interesting insights on it. Okay, so the Pissarides model is trying to capture those frictions. It's trying to capture that externality. We'll talk about it explicitly. Okay, so it's going to allow for the simultaneous existence of vacancies and unemployed people who want to find a job, and there's no out of the labor force. So either you're working or you're not, and you're not choosing to leave the labor force. So it's, if you're unemployed, you're interested in getting a job, and if you get one, you're going to get it, you're going to take it. It's a very simple model. There's no rejection, okay? So being choosy doesn't come into this model at all. There are no rejections. So we're trying to make it as simple as possible so you get the ideas. And basically, you'll see that this friction, not being able to get all the offers that are on the table immediately, is enough to generate a positive rate of unemployment. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to endogenize F. So next week, F is a function of the ratio of unemployed vacancies to unemployed. Okay, that's going to be a sufficient statistic for us. Okay, so the central element of Pissarides is making F come to life. It's not a constant anymore, it's going to come to life. We're going to give it some life, and therefore we're going to give it this life by defining a function that maps unemployed people and vacancies into jobs. We're going to call it the matching function. Okay, so it's a little bit like the production function in microeconomics or macro. And this was Pissarides' invention in some sense, and some other people have talked about it, but it's a way of formalizing. We think of this as this is coming out of this bathtub, right? But what is actually in the bathtub? These people are interacting, maybe it's like Brownian motion, molecules are bumping off each other. Obviously, if 2 unemployed people meet, it's totally uninteresting, so we don't care about that. The assumption is that the unemployed people are interacting with the vacancies, and the vacancies are interacting with employed people. And again, there's so much complexity already in that idea that we have to simplify it a lot. So we're going to, the first thing we're going to do is we're just going to assume that this function is stable. Okay, so x is a stable function of the stock of unemployment and the stock of vacancies. They're both stocks, like the level of unemployment in the bathtub or the level of vacancies. And we're going to assume that this function has constant returns to scale. Okay, who wants to remind me what constant returns to scale is? Yes?
Double the inputs, the outputs are going to be double.
Right. Okay, so it's a scale invariance of this function in some sense. In the sense that if you scale up u and v by the same positive number, you're going to get that positive number times the output. So again, this matching function is a flow that's attached to 2 stocks. So if I double the stocks, I get double the flows. That sounds like an innocuous assumption, but it's very important. It basically implies that Luxembourg and Germany can have the same unemployment rate under the same economic conditions. Just because Germany's bigger doesn't mean that Germany's labor markets work any better than Luxembourg's. That's the assumption. You might say that's crazy. Maybe you think big cities, big countries, whatever, work better than small ones. Okay, you can prove it to me, but right now the data seem to indicate that at least at a macroeconomic level, this is a pretty good starting working assumption for this level of reasoning. Okay, so this matching function is key. Because if you let me assume constant returns to scale, I can do exactly what you said, and I can create rates of success in the labor market. I can divide this x by u, or I can divide it by v. And that's kind of the rate of matching with either unemployment or vacancies. Okay, so that's a really interesting idea. In fact, it gives us the outflow rate. Okay, so just look at that formula. All I did was divide by u, and because of constant returns to scale, u is a scalar, and I divided into both the arguments because of the constant returns property, and therefore this outflow rate is a function of 1, which is a constant, so I can drop it, and v over u. And I've already normalized to make it see what I've done? I've normalized these rates to make them a fraction of the labor force. Most of what we'll do from now on will be in terms of rates. So the vacancy rate is a fraction of the total labor force, total number of vacancies divided by the available workers, working and not working, and the unemployment rate. So if you allow me to do the constant returns to scale assumption, I can write f as x divided by u, which is equal to x of v divided by u. Little v divided by little u. Okay, so that ratio is a sufficient statistic for the success rate of workers in this economy. If that's the matching function, that vacancy to unemployment ratio, sometimes it's called labor market tightness, is a sufficient statistic for the difficulty of workers finding jobs. And I could have divided by v. I could have said, hey, I want to do this in a different way. I want to divide by v. So I also get a rate. And that's kind of the rate of success from the firm's perspective. Okay, that would be the rate at which firms' posted vacancies actually get matched with workers successfully. Again, in this model, it's contact equals success. We're not doing any choosiness yet. This is the easy one. So if we bump into each other in the club, we're paired up. Okay? It's like that. The bathtub, you run into each other, it's success. It's guaranteed. There's no rejection. Okay, so again, we start easy, and therefore, it turns out that very convenient and Klausur relevant is that f is equal to theta times q. Okay, so Thomas will, in the section, will again drive this into your heads. If you know what x is, if you know what the matching function is, you can prove this very easily. But even if you don't know, if you know you have constant returns, it must be the case that the success for workers is related to the success rate of firms by this ratio of vacancies to unemployment, this labor market tightness statistic. So again, not surprisingly, this labor market statistic is the slope of a ray in the beverage curve that goes through the points on the beverage curve. Right? So when you're up like this, we've got tight labor markets. When you're down like this, we have less tight, slack labor markets. Okay, so Germany looks like this now, but 10 years ago it looked like this. So that's a really interesting statistic. You don't have to believe it's a sufficient statistic. You might think that this model is not very useful, but if you take the model seriously, it is sufficient. And if you know what f is, you kind of know what this is. And if you know what the function is that made q, you can generate f. Okay, it's really easy, and you should do that as a practice, just to remind yourself how constant returns to scale affects us, because it's also true of other things in economics, production function, etc. Okay, so this is the Ausblick. This is for next time. Okay, so I'm going to introduce why this is important. Pissarides' model, it's in chapter 1 of his famous book, which is online in our Moodle intranet. It's going to have the following properties. Basically, every worker works for exactly one firm, and every firm employs exactly one worker. Okay? So it's a start. And because I have constant returns to scale, I can do that. Okay? And also I'm going to assume that there's constant returns to scale in production. So one worker generates 1 unit of output, or generates X units of output. 10 workers generate 10X units of output. That's going to make things very easy, because then we can ignore the firm for the first instance. Later on we'll come back and think about the firm. Right now we just want to understand how these things interact. How the firms post vacancies because they want to find a worker. If they can find a worker, they get productivity P, they have to pay the worker wage, and then they have a profit. Okay? Workers, if they're unemployed, they get B. So they get some unemployment benefit, or they get some private use of leisure, they have some free time on their hands, but they're not working. Okay? If they work, they get W, and in equilibrium, W is going to be greater than B. So there's going to be a reason to want to work in this model, and you're going to be not happy if you don't have a job. So this is going to satisfy some of our properties that we were looking for before. People will not actually want to work. And this is the most important part of this model. This is what got Pissarides the Nobel Prize. Okay, so the wage is not determined by Marshall. The wage is determined by bargaining. Okay, so this is really attractive. And Pissarides was the guy who figured how to stick this in a model. And Diamond had different ideas, Morton had different ideas, but there's a bargain involved, and the bargain depends on, what does the bargain depend on?
Unions, for example?
Well, no unions in this model, because we're all single agents. You could put unions, you could do all sorts of, but the union power could be proxied by beta. Okay, so what I want to hear first off is bargaining power, just so we can get finished. Bargaining power. So, in a country where there are strong trade unions, the workers have more bargaining power. So when they do meet up, the workers will be able to get more of the surplus. The wage is determined by the surplus. So the other question was, what determines the surplus? In a bargaining world, think about micro. Yeah.
Also outside options.
Yeah, exactly. So what is your outside option if you're unemployed?
Social welfare.
Part of the story, but not the whole story. You're right. Okay, and that's going to be the value of leisure is kind of social welfare. Maybe you don't, maybe you do have access to it. It could be also just the value of just taking walks in this beautiful weather today, that sort of thing. But what else? What else is involved?
The wealth I have. The wealth. If I have.
Yeah, if you have. Okay, so if you have some wealth stored up already, these guys don't have it because we want to make it simple. Because if you don't, you have to worry about heterogeneity. It gets nasty. So again, it's a good point.
My idea about the future, maybe.
Okay.
I think the rating could be better, and next week there will be more vacancies.
Okay, so you might think that things are changing, and then your anticipation of the future matter. That's exactly right.
Other jobs?
Other jobs, same thing. Again, this is a world where everyone knows that everyone's the same, so we're shutting that down intentionally. The value of unemployment depends on the periodic payment today, but also what you might get in the future. So it's not just anticipations, it's the fact that you may get a job, even if you don't have one today. Okay, so it's certainly whether these jobs are better or worse matters, but the very fact that you can get a job in the next period means that unemployment is more valuable than just getting the benefit. Okay, so if it's a really tight labor market, you may have a really good chance of getting a job. Even if you get one this period, things look pretty good tomorrow. Okay, so you're gonna be a little bit more powerful in bargaining. If you do get that job offer, you say, look, you know, I get B, and if you give me a lousy wage offer and our bargaining breaks down, then I have this fantastic fallback position. So that's what the Nash bargain and cuts through to the quick and says, okay, the wage that we negotiate will be a weighted average of these two fallback positions. And my fallback position as worker is actually B plus something that we'll derive next week. Okay? And the Pisserese model is really, I mean, this is very simple. So a lot of you probably say, God, economists, they're always looking at these really stupid models. You know, you got to start somewhere because the world is complicated. You'll never get anywhere if you don't understand the basics. So what we're going to be doing basically is we're going to look at the workers' valuations of being employed and unemployed in the steady state. We're not going to look at dynamics at all. It's much too hard for this course. So steady state means that my valuation of unemployment today, my valuation of tomorrow are the same. In other words, the valuation, not the unemployment rate, but the valuation of unemployment as a state. So if you look at this bathtub, we're going to be looking at situations where the unemployment rate is constant. That's what we call a steady state. Okay? Again, it's not a, given how much these numbers move in Germany and the United States, it's not a bad assumption. The number of people who leave unemployment every month is enormous. So the equilibrium approach is actually pretty powerful. And at the end, I'll finish now. This is the last slide. Very important verbal summary of what we're doing by Robert Lucas, one of our heroes in macro, who basically said, the reason why we do this is because we think of unemployment. Certainly it's a bad thing. People don't like it, and Pissere's model predicts that. But if you get a job, it's a gain because it's not just the wage you get tomorrow, it's the wage tomorrow and the fact that you can continue to earn the wage for several periods into the future. And if you're unemployed right now, you may be unemployed for several periods. And this finding rate is going to matter and how we value that asset. So Lucas's idea was, and this is not a very particularly well recognized piece of his literature, of his work. I mean, I think he was almost making a casual statement about how to think about unemployment because he was under criticism for thinking about voluntary unemployment. And a lot of people were putting him in a bad corner. But in fact, he was just trying to say that in a labor market where we have states and you're moving from one state to the next, every time you move, you're experiencing a capital gain or a capital loss. Right? So think about how it is when you go in the job market and maybe you didn't get a job right away. The minute you get that job offer, you feel fantastic. And why do you feel fantastic? Because your whole permanent income has increased. The capitalized value of your potential earnings has gone up. Okay, so that's kind of what he's trying to get at. And similarly, when you lose your job, you're coming down a notch, right, for whatever reasons. And that's kind of what we're going to try to get at with the Pisserese model. The Pisserese model will help us understand this very deep statement that Lucas made 40 years ago. Okay, so thanks for paying attention. I hope to see you all again next week. And if you do stay, please go to Thomas's section on Friday. You have a question?
There is no tutorial on Friday, right?
Yes.
There is.
Yes.
No.
I introduced Thomas? No?
But the Feiertag, right?
Right.
The holiday on Friday.
Oh yeah. Good Friday. Sorry.
And Monday there's...
God, I'm such a bad teacher, man. Yeah, Good Friday. I don't want to terrorize you. I don't want to crucify you, right?
Next Monday as well.
Yeah, Monday is also holiday. Yeah. So the Germany is undermining my course. So I would urge you all to look at Pisserese, think hard about it, and Thomas will,
One word.
yeah, Thomas will, next, Friday after next.
Next week, Friday.
Right, so see you later, thank you.